The day started the way most of my days did. Too early, too loud, and not nearly enough coffee. My son Caleb had been awake since 5:30 in the morning, which wasn't unusual for him. He was 12 years old, sharp as a tack, and absolutely relentless in his cheerfulness, which was both the greatest gift I had ever received in my life and also, at 5:30 on a Tuesday morning,
The
when I
pressure
had a
is
7
spiking. I
o'clock
have to
shift at the
isolate it.
hospital,
Do it. What's the reading?
something that tested the
480
limits
Kelvin.
of my
It's not
patience
stable.
in ways I never
Hurry.
expected parenthood would. He was chattering about a documentary he had watched the night before about deep-sea creatures, something reversed, about a specific species of anglerfish that had genuinely disturbed him, and I was half listening while I made his lunch and sorted through the pile of permission slips in school
Keep up, kiddo.
newsletters
I'm
that had
trying.
accumulated
You're
on
doing
the
great.
kitchen
Thanks, Dad.
counter over the past 2 weeks. It was the kind of morning that felt like 100 other mornings, unremarkable and familiar and safe.
Just breathe, sweetie.
And I think that's
It's
the part
hard.
that makes what happened
know,
later
you're
feel
doing
so
great.
much more like a gut punch. I look back on it now. Caleb had been in a wheelchair for almost 3 years at that point.
We
A
have to act
degenerative
now.
condition
Every second we
affecting
delay,
his
the
lower
situation
limbs had
gets
been
worse.
diagnosed when he was
Please, you
9.
have to listen to me.
And while the early days of that diagnosis had been devastating in ways I still don't have the right words for, we had eventually, slowly, painfully,
Is this the right one?
and with the help of an extraordinary team of doctors and
got it.
therapists, built a life that worked. A life that accommodated his needs without making him feel like his needs were the center of everything. That had been important to me, and more importantly, it had been important to Caleb, who was at an age where dignity
You're doing
and
so well,
independence
sweetie.
mattered enormously.
Just
And who
rest
would rather
now.
struggle
I'm
to
right
do
here.
something himself for 20
We have
minutes
to go
than
now.
ask
It's
for
our
help
only
in 30
chance.
seconds.
We're with you.
The
Lead the
ramp
way.
at our front
Stay
door
close.
had been
This is
part
it.
of that. It was a good ramp,
Ma'am, I need you to step
solid
back.
pressure-treated
But officer,
wood
what's happening?
with a
It's
non-slip
not safe.
surface.
Please stay back.
Built to code, wide enough for his chair to move comfortably, with rails on both sides that he could grip when he wanted to pull himself up without relying on the motorized function of his chair. His therapist, Dr. Nguyen, had specifically praised it during her last home visit. She said it was one of the better home modifications she had seen, and that Caleb's ability to enter and exit his home independently was doing measurable good for his confidence
Wow, Dad,
and
it's
his
so
sense
pretty.
of autonomy.
It is. Just
I
like
remember
you,
feeling
sweetie.
genuinely
Look at the
proud when she
birds.
said that.
Beautiful.
I had built a large portion of it myself on weekends, with help from my brother-in-law and a YouTube tutorial that we watched approximately 47 times. I dropped Caleb off at school at 7:50. Watched him wheel himself through the accessible entrance with his backpack and his anglerfish thoughts, and then drove 20 minutes to the hospital where I worked as a charge nurse in the pediatric unit. It was a busy shift. It almost always was, and I didn't think about
Wow,
home
Dad, it's
once
so
in the
pretty.
9 hours
It
I was
is.
there.
Just like you,
I
sweetie.
thought about my
Look at the
patients.
birds.
Beautiful.
I thought about the family in room 7 who had been there for 3 weeks and were exhausted in a way that went bone deep. I thought about the new intake protocol we were trialing and whether it was actually improving anything or just creating more paperwork. I thought about whether I had remembered to take the chicken out of the freezer that morning. I did not think about my front porch or my ramp or my neighbor Linda Marsh, who lived 2 houses down and had been a quiet but persistent source of tension in our neighborhood. For the better part of 4 years, I did not think about any of those things because I had no reason to. I could not have imagined, not in any version of that morning's thinking, that by the time I got home, the thing I had built for my son, the thing that let him come home every day on his own terms, would be gone. I got the call at 4:17 in the afternoon. It was Caleb's school counselor, Ms. Ferraro, and her voice had that particular, careful quality that people use when they are trying very hard not to alarm you, while also telling you something that is genuinely alarming. She said that Caleb had been picked up by the after-school transport as usual, that he had arrived home at the regular time, and that the driver, a wonderful man named Gerald, who had been doing that route for 6 years and who Caleb adored, had been unable to drop him off safely because, and here she paused in a way that felt like a held breath, the ramp was gone. Not damaged. Not partially removed, gone. The hardware had been unscrewed from the house. The wooden sections had been stacked in an unceremonious pile on the lawn, and Caleb was sitting in his chair on the sidewalk in front of our house, unable to get inside, waiting for someone to figure out what to do. Gerald had stayed with him, which I will be grateful for until the end of my life. But that didn't change what had happened or what it meant that my 12-year-old son with a physical disability had come home from school to find that someone had decided his access to his own house was less important than whatever rule or aesthetic preference had motivated them to make that call, without ever once speaking to me first. Asterisk. Broke approximately for traffic laws getting home from the hospital that afternoon. I know that's not something to be proud of. And I want to be clear that I was not proud of it. I was terrified, and I was furious. And those two things together produce a kind of tunnel vision that is not conducive to careful driving. I called Gerald on the way, and he told me Caleb was okay, that he had given him a granola bar and they were listening to the radio together in the van. And that Caleb was, and this is what broke me open a little on that drive, that Caleb was trying very hard to seem like it wasn't a big deal. That was so like him. That was so precisely, heartbreakingly like him that I had to grip the steering wheel hard and breathe through my nose for a moment before I could respond. He was 12 years old, and he was sitting on the sidewalk because someone had taken his ramp while he was at school. And he was trying to make it easier for the adults around him by pretending it was fine. Asterisk, I pulled up to the house at 4:52. Gerald's van was parked at the curb, and Caleb waved at me through the window with his characteristic cheerfulness, which under the circumstances felt like a small act of heroism. The ramp was exactly as described, the sections stacked neatly on the grass, which somehow made it worse, the neatness, because it meant this had not been an accident or a storm or some senseless act of random destruction. Someone had done this carefully. Someone had done this with intention and organization. I helped Caleb inside through the back door, which required navigating a portion of our uneven yard that he normally avoided because the terrain was difficult. And I watched his jaw set in that particular way. It did when something was hard, and he didn't want to acknowledge that it was hard. And I felt a rage that I had no immediate productive outlet for settle into my chest like a stone. Asterisk. I knew it was Linda before I had spoken to a single person. I want to be honest about that. I knew it the same way you know things sometimes when you have been paying attention to a situation
Ma'am,
for
I need
long
you to
enough.
step back.
Not
But
because I
officer,
had
what's
proof,
happening?
It's not
because
safe.
someone
Please
told
stay
me.
back.
But because the logic of it led there, and because Linda Marsh was the only person in our neighborhood who had ever expressed a problem with the ramp. She had done so twice in the past year, both times through the HOA, our homeowners association, which governs certain aesthetic and structural elements of our small planned community. And both times her complaints had been dismissed because the ramp had been properly permitted, built to code, and explicitly protected under the Fair Housing Act as a reasonable accommodation for a resident with a disability. The HOA board had told her this. I had told her this. A very polite letter from my attorney had told her this. And yet here we were, standing in the rubble of that outcome, so to speak, because Linda Marsh had apparently decided that the legal channels had failed her, and it was time to take matters into her own hands.
We have to go now. It's our only
Asterisk.
chance.
She
We're
came
with you.
over at
Lead the way.
5:15.
Stay close. This is
I
it.
saw her walking up my driveway from the kitchen window, and I took 3 very deliberate breaths before I opened the door, because I knew that what I said in this conversation was going to matter enormously, and I needed to say it without screaming. She was carrying, I am not making this up, a laminated copy of the HOA's Community Standards document, the relevant sections highlighted in yellow. She had reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she was wearing the particular expression of someone who has decided they are in the right and has prepared extensively for the conversation in which they will explain why. She told me, in a voice that was infuriatingly measured and reasonable, that the ramp was not in compliance with the HOA's architectural standards, that it had altered the visual character of the street-facing facade of my home in a way that was specifically prohibited under Section 4.7 of the Community Guidelines, and that the
You're doing
HOA's
so well,
hired maintenance
sweetie.
crew had removed it that morning
Just
in
rest
her
now.
request following
I'm right here.
what she described as a formal complaint she had filed the previous Thursday. She said she was sorry if this was inconvenient, but that rules existed for a reason, and that she had given me more than enough time to address the issue through proper channels. Asterisk. Stood in my doorway looking at this woman for what felt like a very long time. Behind me, I could hear Caleb in the living room, the television on low, probably still pretending everything was fine. I thought about the 3 months I had saved to build that ramp, I thought about Caleb sitting on the sidewalk. I thought about the word inconvenient and the way she had used it, and I made myself breathe again. Then I told her very quietly that what she had done was not just against HOA policy, it was a federal civil rights violation. That removing an accommodation for a disabled person without notice or legal authority was a violation of the Fair Housing Act, and that I would be speaking with my attorney by end of business that evening. I told her to keep the laminated document because I suspected she was going to need it. Then I closed the door. My attorney's name is Patricia Okafor. She's one of those people who becomes extremely calm when you present her with a situation that merits genuine anger, which I have always found both deeply reassuring and slightly unnerving. I called her at 5:30 that evening, still standing in my kitchen while Caleb ate dinner in the next room. And I told her everything, the ramp, the removal, Linda, the laminated document, the HOA, all of it. Patricia listened without interrupting, which was characteristic of her. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Okay, this is going to be straightforward, which in my experience of working with lawyers means the opposite of what it sounds like. It means this is clear-cut legally. But getting there is going to take time and paperwork and several strongly worded letters and possibly a courtroom at the end of it." I said, "I understood." She said she would start drafting that evening. Asterisk, the legal framework here is worth explaining, because I think a lot of people don't realize how clearly the law protects against exactly what Linda Marsh had done. The Fair Housing Act, as amended in 1988, explicitly prohibits discrimination in housing on the basis of disability.
Yes, got it.
It also specifically protects a tenant's or homeowner's right to make reasonable modifications to their living space to accommodate a disability, and in the case of a homeowner, not a renter, you don't even need permission to make those modifications. You just need to comply with local building codes, which we had. An HOA cannot override the Fair Housing Act. A neighbor cannot override the Fair Housing Act. The laminated community standards document that Linda had waved at me was, legally speaking, subordinate in every meaningful way to federal civil rights law. And the fact that she had involved the HOA's maintenance crew meant that the HOA itself was potentially liable as well, which Patricia said was actually helpful from our perspective because it meant there was an institutional actor with assets and legal counsel, who was now going to have to reckon with what had happened. Asterisk. Patricia sent a letter to the HOA board the following morning, a Thursday, and I am told it was, in the words of one board member who later spoke to me about it, the kind of letter that makes you very quiet for a little while. It outlined the violation, cited the relevant statutes, documented the timeline, noted Caleb's diagnosis and the medical recommendation from his therapist supporting the ramp, and requested both immediate restoration of the ramp at the HOA's expense and a written explanation of how a maintenance crew had been authorized to remove a legally protected accommodation without any notice to me, any legal review, or any apparent awareness that what they were doing might constitute a federal civil rights violation. It also mentioned, in language I found
We have to act
deeply
now.
satisfying
Every
to
second
read,
we delay, the
that
situation
my
gets worse.
attorney would be filing
Please,
a
you have
formal
to listen
complaint
to
with
me.
the Department of Housing and Urban Development if the matter was not resolved within 72 hours. Asterisk. The board met on an emergency basis that Friday evening. I was not invited, but I received a call from the board president, a man named Dave Kowalski, who had always seemed to me like someone doing his best in a role. He hadn't entirely understood when he volunteered for it, and he was apologetic in a comprehensive and thorough way that suggested he had spoken to the HOA's own legal counsel and received some significant news. He told me the HOA had not actually reviewed Linda's complaint before authorizing the removal, that a maintenance coordinator had processed it administratively, without flagging it for board review or legal consideration, and that the board was horrified. That word was his by what had happened. He said the ramp would be restored at the HOA's full expense and that they would use a licensed contractor to ensure it met the original specifications. He asked if there was anything else they could do. I told him there was, and that Patricia would be in touch with a list. Asterisk, meanwhile, something else had been happening that I hadn't anticipated. My neighbor across the street, a retired teacher named Miriam, whose opinion carried considerable weight in the neighborhood, had seen the ramp removal from her window that morning and had spent Thursday calling every other household on our block to tell them what had happened. By Friday evening, there were 7 families who had signed a written statement describing what a positive presence Caleb was in the neighborhood, affirming that the ramp had never struck any of them as an eyesore, and expressing their concern that a neighbor's complaint had resulted in a disabled child being locked out of his own home. Miriam delivered this to the HOA board president in person. She also, according to what Dave told me later, used some words that I won't reproduce here, but that apparently made a significant impression on the assembled board members. Want to pause here and talk about Caleb? Because the legal machinery and the neighborhood politics and the HOA liability are not actually the story. They are the scaffolding around the story. The story is my son. The story is a 12-year-old boy who came home from school on a Tuesday and found that someone had decided, without consulting him or his mother or his doctor
I know.
or
You're doing
anyone
great.
who actually knew anything about his life, that the thing he needed to live in his own house with dignity was less important than the visual consistency of a residential street. And the story is what that does to a kid, not just in the immediate, practical, sitting on the sidewalk sense, but in the deeper sense, the sense that accumulates quietly and that you don't always see until you're looking back. Asterisk. Caleb did not have a meltdown that night. He did not cry or rage or ask me why someone would do something like that, which were all things I might have expected and would have found easier to address than what he actually did, which was to be very quiet and very calm and eat his dinner and watch television and go to bed at the normal time. He said he was fine. He said it wasn't a big deal. He said these things with such conviction that if I hadn't known him as completely and thoroughly as only a parent can know a child, I might have believed him. But I had been watching him for 12 years, and I knew the way his shoulders held differently. When something had gotten through to him, and that night his shoulders were carrying something that hadn't been there in the morning. Asterisk, we talked about it the next day.
Keep up,
Saturday,
kiddo!
when the
I'm
urgency
trying.
of the immediate
You're doing
crisis
great.
had receded
Thanks, Dad.
slightly, and there was space to actually sit with it. I had made waffles, which are Caleb's designated comfort food, and we were sitting at the kitchen table and he was eating, and I asked him, as carefully as I could, how he was doing with everything. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that I have thought about many times since, something that landed in me with the particular weight of a truth that a child expresses without realizing its full dimensions. He said, I know I'm supposed to need extra stuff. I know the ramp is extra, but I don't think about it as extra when I'm using it. I just think about it as how I get in the house. So when it wasn't there, it felt like, I don't know, like someone was showing me that it's actually extra, like reminding me. He picked at his waffle for a moment. I didn't like being reminded. Asterisk. I kept my face very still while he said that. And then I said something that I hoped was useful. Something about how the things he needed to live his life fully were not extra, that they were just his. The same way my reading glasses were mine, the same way the step stool I used to reach the top cabinet was mine, ordinary tools for ordinary living that happened to be calibrated to him specifically. He nodded in the way he nodded when he was thinking rather than agreeing. Then he said he wanted to be there when they put the ramp back, because he wanted to see it go back up. I told him he absolutely would be. Asterisk, there was a school component to all of this too, which I navigated with the help of Ms. Ferraro and Caleb's homeroom teacher. Some of his classmates had apparently seen him posting about it on the social platform that middle schoolers were using that year. He had been characteristically measured about it, describing the situation factually without dramatizing it, and several of them had responded with a kind of fierce 12-year-old solidarity that I found both moving and slightly chaotic, because some of them had started a group chat about it that I was told got very animated before Ms. Ferraro intervened. One of his friends, a girl named Sophie, had asked her parents whether they could come over and help rebuild the ramp, not knowing that it was going to be professionally restored. When Caleb told me about this, he smiled in a way that I hadn't seen from him in the 48 hours since the removal. And it was a real smile, not the careful managed version he had been offering me. And I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized had been tight. Asterisk. His physical therapist called me that week as well. After I emailed her to let her know what had happened, Dr. Nguyen was calm and practical as always. But there was something else underneath the calmness, a controlled fury that I recognized. Because I was carrying the same thing, and she offered without my asking to write a formal medical letter documenting the clinical necessity of the ramp, if it would be useful. For any legal proceedings, it was useful. Patricia incorporated it into our HUD filing. The ramp went back up 9 days after it had been taken down. The HOA hired a licensed contractor, a better one, frankly, than my brother-in-law and I had used, though I say that with affection for my brother-in-law, and they rebuilt it to the original specifications with some upgrades, including a slightly wider landing at the top and a coat of stain that matched our porch trim better than the original had. I stood outside and watched it happen. Caleb sat beside me in his chair in the driveway and watched it happen too. He had brought his headphones, but he didn't put them in. When the contractor finished and stepped back and the ramp was there again, solid and real and connected to our porch, Caleb rolled forward and went up it and opened the front door and went inside and came back out. And then he looked at me and shrugged in the way that meant, yeah, that's right, that's how it should be. I laughed. I hadn't laughed much that week, and it felt like exhaling something I'd been holding. Asterisk. The legal and administrative aftermath took longer. Patricia filed our formal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which initiated an investigation into both Linda Marsh, individually, and the HOA's processes that had allowed the removal to happen. I want to be accurate here. I don't know the full outcome of all of it, because these processes are slow and some portions of them remain ongoing even now. But what I can tell you is that the HOA overhauled its complaint and maintenance authorization process, added a legal review requirement for any action affecting a resident's property, and sent a letter to all residents clarifying that accommodations for disabled residents were legally protected and could not be removed or obstructed under any circumstances. They also sent, at Patricia's insistence, a written apology to me and to Caleb specifically by name, which he read with great seriousness and then filed in the folder where he keeps important documents, alongside his passport and his medical records and a certificate he won in a robotics competition. 2 years ago, asterisk, as for Linda Marsh, she remained in the neighborhood. I want to be careful about how I talk about this because my feelings about it are genuinely complicated. I was angry at her for a long time, a deep and specific anger that had Caleb's face on it. And I don't think I'm entirely past that anger even now. But I also, over time, and with the perspective that time provides, came to understand that what she had done was the product of a certain kind of person who was mistaken. Authority over aesthetics for authority over people, who has mistaken the right to live in a nice-looking neighborhood for the right to determine what is and isn't acceptable about the lives of her neighbors. That's a failure of imagination and of empathy. And it's a common enough failure that being furious at each individual instance of it will
The pressure is spiking. I have to isolate it.
Run out.
Do it. What's the reading?
What I try to hold on
480
to
Kelvin. It's not
instead
stable.
is the image
Hurry.
of Caleb rolling up his ramp on the day it was restored. Matter of fact and unhurried, exactly as he had done every day before. The normality of it. The rightness of it. Asterisk. There is something I want to say about the HOA as an institution, because I think it matters. HOAs can be genuinely useful structures for maintaining shared spaces and managing community standards. And I don't think they are inherently adversarial to the people they serve. But they can become instruments of petty control when the people operating them lose sight of the distinction between community standards and personal preferences. And when the people living within them don't understand that federal civil rights law sits above their laminated rule books in every possible way. What happened to us happened in part because systems that were designed for administrative convenience. A maintenance coordinator processing a complaint without review. A board that was too hands-off to catch it. Allowed one person's complaint to have consequences that none of those systems designers would have sanctioned if they'd been paying attention. That's a systemic failure. And the remedy is systemic, better training, clearer review processes. In a culture within the organization that treats accommodation not as an exception to the rules but as a fundamental obligation. Asterisk Caleb is 14 now. He uses his ramp every day. He has become in the way that adolescents sometimes become things without quite deciding to. Something of an informal expert on disability rights, not in an academic way, but in the way of someone who has personal stakes in the subject and has done the reading. He mentioned recently that he was thinking about studying law, which surprised me a little and also didn't surprise me at all. He said he wanted to understand why some rules protect people and some rules are just rules. I told him that was actually a very sophisticated way to frame the question. He said he'd been thinking about it for a while. I believe him. I believe that he has been sitting with what happened to him at 12, on that sidewalk, listening to the radio with Gerald, trying to make it easier for everyone around him by pretending it was fine, and I believe he has been turning it over and finding the shape of it, the thing inside it that is worth understanding. I hope he does study law. I hope he studies it the way he studies everything, with the particular, ferocious attention of someone who has already learned that the rules are not neutral and that who they protect and who they fail is a choice that someone made, and that someone else can choose differently. The ramp is up. It's not going anywhere.